Hi guys, my name is Allie Versteeg, and I will be talking about the Lyric Theater in downtown Lexington and the Kentucky Arts Council as my two organizations for this assignment. So the anchor organization I chose, the Lyric Theater, for those of you who don't know, is a theater in Lexington. It is in the east end of Lexington, which tends to be a lower income area. Um, and it focuses a lot on African American culture and the artists that they bring in, and also just the fact that they know their audience is low income, so they try to provide really financially accessible programming. So, speaking on that a little bit more, going into the first point about their approaches of drawing audiences, as I just mentioned, one of their approaches is to have really financially accessible programming. So, they have a lot of free shows and programs, a lot of pay what you can. So a perfect example of that actually is something called the Black Lens film series that happens every Thursday night, and it is totally free to get in, and it's basically just them showing a movie every Thursday. Um, so that's a pretty good example of one of their more financially accessible programs, which I think is really great for them because it shows they know their audience really well. They know that people in the East End don't really have the financial ability to pay that much for shows. So I think it's a really good approach to drawing an audience since they know their audience so well. Um, let's see. The Lyric in general is very focused on the tight knit community of the East End and preserving the culture of the East End. So that's another way they draw their audience in. They show their community what they want to see because they know their family in the East End very well. Um, so that's another way that they approach drawing an audience. Um, some questions and concerns I would have for the Lyric, going on to that other point, would be that the Lyric has not actually been open very long. The building itself is 70 years old, but it was closed for a long period of time, I believe about 40 years. And the Lyric as we know it today has only been open since 2010. It's been open for about 8 years and does not have a very big budget as a result of that. Also, just being an arts organization in general doesn't have a very big budget. So, one of my concerns for them would be although they're financially accessible shows and marketing where they have free shows and pay what you can shows, it's very smart and it's very good that they provide accessible programming to the community. However, it would draw a little bit of concern for me due to the fact that they have such a small budget that they're not bringing in a lot of revenue. Hopefully, that means they can stay financially afloat, but as an outside observer, that would be one of my concerns for them. Um, Another concern that I would probably have for this organization is the fact that it is so specific to the East End, which can be a really good thing because obviously they know their audience very well. It aligns with their mission. They're really driven as to what they want to do. But you think about how it could alienate some audiences, alienate some potential programming, potential revenue coming in. Obviously, I'm not a part of the organization, so I don't know anything about how their current programming works for them. Maybe it works for them just fine. It probably does, seeing as how they're relatively successful, but that would be a concern to me for maybe a long-term plan, would be the fact that they are very specific and that could potentially hurt them. On that note, going to the second part of this question where it talks about would this approach work for other organizations, the Lyrics' general approach to their audience and marketing, I would say no. I would say that their programming and the way that they draw their audience and their marketing would not work for most organizations. That's not to say there aren't some that it would work for. The only reason I say this is just because, as I have been mentioning, it is so specific to this one area of Lexington. So if you were to have an organization that was similar in that regard, where they had a location they were really specific about marketing to and reaching, then I would say this approach would work, but I wouldn't say that it would work for general organizations as a whole because it is just too specific. Um, as far as the work that the Lyric does in the community, I think that their work is very important to their community in the East End and in Lexington in general because it is one of the only organizations in the East End doing what it does. It's one of the only organizations that is trying to preserve the arts, the culture, and most importantly, the community of the East End. So I think their work is very important to that community. Um, on that note, they have been active in fostering social change in Lexington, not only in just the East End, but in, I believe it was 2016, potentially 2017, or at least going into 2017, the movement Take Back Cheapside was going on, which was a movement to remove the Confederate statues that were in Lexington because they believed it didn't reflect the values of Lexington and represented a false history of the city. And the Lyric actually aligned itself with that project towards the end of it and worked really closely with them. So I would say that was a perfect example of them fostering social change in Lexington, which did not only affect the East End as much of their programming and marketing does. Not all, but a lot of it. I would say they are, however, pretty in line with the status quo as an arts organization, just because, as far as I've seen, they don't host a lot of really avant-garde or specific artists that would have a specific audience. They do tend to have acts that are more publicly accessible. Maybe they would market to just a certain demographic, but not necessarily artists or art that's really challenging or hard to find an audience for. It's usually pretty open to at least their community. So I would say in that regard it is more conventional. It does stick a little bit to the status quo. Moving on to the Kentucky Arts Council, the state agency I wanted to talk about. On their end of things, they obviously have a very different approach to attracting the audience than the Lyric does because they have a lot bigger audience to attract. They have to appeal to the entire state of Kentucky as opposed to the Lyric having just this one specific community. So in order to do that, it seems like they have a broader mission, vision, broader values, such as they talk about how they support diversity in the arts and preserving cultural resources of Kentucky, which is just talking about how they want to honor Kentucky's past and heritage, which are also values that align perfectly with the Lyric. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But that's how they attempt to draw in their audiences, by just being really clear about their values and what they want to achieve as an organization. And their work is very important in the community because they support dozens of organizations around Kentucky, more than that, but they support many, many arts organizations in Kentucky that probably couldn't get by without them, financially and just by supporting them and promoting them. This work to me is very important because on the state level, inspiring artists and art organizations is very important for establishing future arts leaders that could potentially open their own organization one day. So obviously that work, to me, I would think, is very important in the community. And then they do tend to uphold the status quo as well. They are a pretty typical state art agency. They are funded in part by the NEA, for example, and their core values like diversity and artist compensation, things like that, are values that are usually held by are typical values to be held by arts organizations around the country. And in addition to that, if we were to talk about fostering social change, I would say they do foster social change just by the fact that they support art, and art often is social change. So I would say in general the Kentucky Arts Agency is a conventional state arts organization that supports arts organizations around the entire state, including the Lyric. So I would say they do go hand in hand because they do have similar values, and in the end, they're all just trying to make wonderful art for the community of Kentucky. Thanks, guys.